Well, good morning. I know we're all so excited to see our own member of Congress while there are others in the country that suffer with lesser lights leading their areas. We do not. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with Congresswoman Lofgren. I'm going to do just a real quick housekeeping, and then I'm going to turn this right over to Zoe. And just to remind all of us that this is a town hall to really focus on H.R. 1. And so what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to fill out question cards. The staff will hold them up. I'm going to see if someone will hold up the cards so that you'll see what you can fill out. Do you have them already in your hands? Okay, great. And if you have a question on a subject that is not H.R. 1, they're going to ask you to fill out constituent forms. You can answer. You know what? Zoe says just forget it. You use those cards that you got already. That's great. But we're going to start with H.R. 1. Is that all right with everyone? All right. So then what we're going to do is Congresswoman Lofgren's going to walk us through the bill. We're going to then do question and answer, and then we're going to wrap up with, I hope, some exciting next steps. Yes? All right, great. Let's turn it over. And let me just say, you all, how many of you know Zoe personally in this room? I think that speaks to just her leadership, that she knows her constituents. And those of you who haven't, and if you haven't had a chance to hear her speak, you are going to be wowed by just, frankly, how smart we are represented in the Congress. So let's give a big warm welcome to Congresswoman Lofgren.
Thanks so much, Cindy Chavez. And I see also here Supervisor Dave Cortese. Thank you, Dave, for being here. So before we begin, I wonder if you'd like to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So before I begin on H.R. 1, let me thank the volunteers who are here. There are many volunteers, but specifically we have students who are volunteering from Evergreen Valley High School, James Lick High School, Santa Teresa High School, Yerba Buena High School, and Monte Vista High School. We also have student volunteers from Santa Clara University and San Jose State. So it's a thrill that they're here. Now, H.R. 1 was the first bill introduced. That's why it's H.R. 1. Because it's so important that the American people have an opportunity to control their own government. And everything else really flows from that. And so that's why we made this the most important bill out the door, and it's why we called it For the People Act. It's a sort of once-in-a-generation reform package that includes really several elements. The first is to make sure that we have fair elections. Now, here in California, we've made great steps in terms of making sure that people can register, that people aren't prevented from voting, but that has not occurred in every part of the United States. We've seen efforts to purge the rolls of people because they missed one election. I mean, you can miss an election because you're sick, and it doesn't mean that you don't want to vote. We've seen situations where people have sent out postcards trying to confuse voters and saying, well, the election has now been moved to Wednesday, or your polling station has been moved when it hasn't. We saw states where they actually closed the polls. One city, they closed the polls and moved it outside of town with no bus access, so nobody could get to the polls. We saw on reservations, and we've had some hearings on this, where Native Americans who didn't have a street address and have always voted with their post office box, all of a sudden the rules were changed without notice and they were all prohibited from voting. So this bill provides that those kinds of shenanigans cannot continue. We have in the bill for federal elections only, and we have had questions, how can we do this? The Constitution of the United States, Article 1, Section 4, says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed by each state, in each state by the legislature thereof, but the next sentence, part of the sentence is what gives us jurisdiction. But the Congress may at any time, by law, make or alter such registrations except as to the place of choosing senators. So it is our Article 1, Section 4 authority that we make these changes to empower voters for federal elections. It introduces automatic voter registration, same-day registration, provides additional assistance for voters with disabilities, prohibits something called voter caging, which prohibits the use of non-forwardable email as a basis for eliminating registration. It prohibits tricking unsuspected voters, as the way I mentioned before. It provides that people who have served their time and have, if they've committed an offense, served their time, paid their dues to society, now they're back as our neighbors, they have their voting rights restored. It provides for durable voter-verified paper ballots, because we know that we have voter systems that are insecure, and if you have a problem, if there's been a cyber incident, you can't have a recount because there's no paper ballot. And that's not the issue here in Santa Clara County, but we have found in some states there's just no written record. And some of these states have voting systems so old, they have software that can no longer be updated. They are very vulnerable to hacking. We do things so that if there is signature verification required, there's an opportunity if someone is disallowed for a voter to go in and fix that disallowance, because people's signatures do change over time. We've made sure that voters overseas, the men and women in the armed services, need an opportunity to cast their vote. So we've made sure that there is adequate time for those individuals serving our country to do that. And we also made sure you have to be an American citizen to vote in a federal election, but the voter ID laws that have been enacted across the United States have, in many cases, prevented American citizens from voting. This is a right. It's a constitutional right. The state of Texas, you could use your gun registration, but you couldn't use your University of Texas registration. So that tells you something. We also have a section about election integrity. Shelby County decision struck down big sections of the Voting Rights Act that had protected minority voters from discrimination, not just in federal elections, but in all elections. So they said there was not sufficient evidence to support that bill. We acknowledge in this bill that we're going to reinstate the Voting Rights Act, and we are going to provide the record for that. For the first time, since the last time the Democrats were in the majority, we have an election subcommittee, and I appointed a woman from Ohio, a lawyer, who has been holding field hearings all over the country, in North Dakota, in Ohio, in North. So we've done something about redistricting. One of the things that we know is that when legislators establish lines to benefit themselves, it actually disempowers the voters. And the voters of California were very smart. I'll be honest, I disagreed with it at the time. I thought, well, why should California give up its advantage? It's one of the few Democratic legislatures. I was wrong. The voters were right. We have citizen commission voter redistricting. They're not allowed to know what the voter registration numbers are, where the incumbents live. They're just drawing it straight up. Community of interest, and that's the way to do it. Vast majorities of voters in this country, Republican, Democratic, and Independent, think that the voters ought to select the politicians instead of the politicians selecting the voters. And this bill would change that nationwide. I mentioned the election security provisions, but let's go into the campaign finance provisions. We have a bill that never got anywhere. It which we believe is important, called the Disclose Act. And it strengthens the ban on foreign money. It makes sure that expenditures are disclosed, and part of that is something called the Honest Ads Act, so that if you spend money on a political ad, you have to disclose who you are, and we've extended that into the cyberspace so that it doesn't prevent you from speaking, but you have to say who you are. And why is that important? I remember back a number of years ago, there was a provision, there was a ballot provision, and it was to control smoking in restaurants. It was polling at like 85%. And then it came out that the proponents of it were the tobacco companies. And why? Because they were trying to preempt stronger provisions that had been enacted in cities and counties all over the state of California. That polling went from 85 down to like 15, because people understand there's a point of view. You need all the information. That's why the Honest Ads Act is important. We've done something about secret money to prevent collusion between committees, to make sure also that presidential inauguration committees fully disclose their expenditures, and it also limits those contributions. It does something really as a pilot project, and we'll see if it works. You know, people worry about the role of big money in politics, rightly so. You want candidates to be able to run without having, you know, billionaires as friends. And so what we did was a publicly funded 6-to-1 match for individuals who can raise money from small donors under $200 up to $50,000, and it's not coming from the taxpayers. There was concern, and I think legitimate concern, that the taxpayers should not fund that campaign. So what we did was find a source of funds that is the fines and forfeitures of corporate wrongdoers. So the fines and forfeitures of the people who did wrong would be funding the people who want to run and do right. Finally, we strengthen campaign oversight. We strengthen ethical standards, not only for the House of Representatives, but also for the judiciary, and also tightened up ethics for the executive branch. Lord knows it's needed. With that, that's a quick overview of the bill. I'm proud of what we did. Obviously, it's just a start. We have our work cut out for us to get these bills that were combined into H.R. 1 into law. Mitch McConnell, who is runs the United States Senate with an iron fist, said this was a power grab for Democrats. No, it's a power grab for the American people. And I am hoping that if they will not accept the entire provision, that we'll be able to find some pieces of this bill that we can agree on, and for those that they will not accept, that the American people will rise up and put some pressure on the United States Senate to get it done. There is not a reason in the world that we shouldn't end gerrymandering of districts. The public wants it, it's the right thing to do, and we ought to do it, and we ought to put some pressure on Mitch McConnell and make sure it happens. Now, I have received, when we had the RSVP, because we wanted to make sure we had enough room for everybody, some people offered questions with their RSVPs. So what I'll start with is a couple of those questions, try and answer them, and then we've got the volunteers are pulling together and trying to sort the questions. Like if there's 5 questions on the same topic, we'll do that, and we'll start with the H.R. 1 questions, and then we'll go on to anything that's on your mind. First, one question, and this was several questions along these lines, about ensuring that only U.S. citizens can vote in national elections. It's absolutely essential that that be done. Only American citizens are permitted to vote in federal elections. H.R. 1 doesn't change that one bit. It requires automatic voter registration agencies to have reliable data about citizenship status and age. There are separate rules for those agencies that don't collect citizenship information. State officials are required to inform applicants of their voting eligibility requirements before registering them and to give them an opportunity to opt out if they're not eligible. Voters have to expressly affirm that they are U.S. citizens before they are registered. State officials have to send them still another notice after they're registered, and it's a crime to vote if you're not a U.S. citizen. So I think that's pretty important, and it's worth noting that the independent reviews of voting systems and voting procedures in the United States have found very little evidence of people pretending to be American citizens and voting. Sometimes people have messed up, and when they do, it's they're prosecuted. There's a woman in Texas who thought she could vote as a legal permanent resident. I think I don't recall the sentence, but it was multiple year sentence that she received in federal prison. So these voter ID laws really, I think in most cases, are a pretext for trying to keep Americans from voting. The other question that was asked at the RSVP, can you roll into H.R. 1 at this time, amend if needed, a prohibition on activities related to giving and receiving information to and from foreign nationals, as well as governments related to election? And there's other questions that came in about social media attempts by foreign nationals and governments to influence our elections. How do we define influence and the like? Obviously, there's a context for this question. H.R. 1 strengthens the ban on foreign national participation in American elections. It makes clear in Section 4101 that foreign nationals may not be involved in the decisions of American corporations or organizations concerning election-related activity. Existing law already prohibits foreign nationals from making campaign contributions or spending money to influence American elections. But, you know, I read the Mueller report, and the special counsel said that it was difficult to find the contributions made to be anything of value. It was broad and inclusive. So one of the things that we're doing is reviewing that report, which was not released when H.R. 1 was reporting, to see if there's some things we can do to tighten up the law on this. We've also, however, updated, as I said, the paid ad requirements on social media so that people will know in real time who paid for those ads, and requiring the platforms to actually acquire that information and to make it available. So the burden is on them, not the individuals who are trying to influence wrongly our elections. What other questions did we have here? What can be done about gerrymandering as a national problem? I mentioned that this does gerrymandering reform at a national level, but we still have gerrymandering for state legislators. We can't get at that as a Congress. That's up to each state to decide. But I do think if we are able to reenact the provision of the Voting Rights Act that was struck down, we will have a much greater opportunity to make sure that the drawing of the lines are fair. As you know, there are a number of cases going up to the Supreme Court about whether you can be so extreme as a partisan redistricting that you're really violating the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause of the United States. When it comes to gerrymandering based on disadvantaging minority voters, the law is very strong, and because of the way the lines are drawn, we may have a much greater opportunity with the Voting Rights Act being reenacted, to do that. So those are basically the questions that were asked online, and now we're going to be getting the questions from all of you. Who's first?
First question from a neighbor here. Substantial portions of H.R. 1 appear to be unconstitutional. What enumerated power gives Congress the ability to intervene with state elections? Isn't this just a fundraising billboard?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, H.R. 1 doesn't regulate state elections. It regulates federal elections. Now, I'll be honest, I hope that states will take the provisions of H.R. 1 and apply them broadly to their entire electoral system. But the Congress does not have authority to order that. We do have the authority under Article 1, Section 4 to regulate the provisions of federal elections. That's what H.R. 1 does. It's clearly not unconstitutional. It's in the Constitution, and I think there's a great need to do so.
Next, we have several questions on felons and voting. This one in particular is from Rita here in the audience, and she writes, under H.R. 1, will a felon have paid their dues when they have served their time? In Florida now, people who have served their time may not be able to vote until they have paid all court-imposed fines, fees, and restitution. It seems like a continuation of, quote, debtor's prison.
I think that's a very good question. Under H.R. 1, once you've completed your sentence, your rights to vote are reinstated in federal elections. I think that's the right thing to do. And certainly, although it's on its face neutral, if you take a look at the disparities in the criminal justice system, there is a discriminatory effect as well in disadvantaging people who've paid their debt and have now been released. I'd like to note in HR when we do something else about prisons, here's the way districting is now done in many states, most states. You count the populations of the inmates in prison for the purpose of redistricting, even though they're not allowed to vote. And so what you end up with is increasing arbitrarily and really falsely the population of districts that are generally very rural, so that there are more of them than urban areas. It's still another way to disadvantage urban Americans. And so we prohibit that, where you will count the people where they last resided, not in the prison, for purposes of redistricting. As for Florida, you know, it's a very disturbing example of a situation that's occurring in some states where voters take a stand forward for a more, what's the right word, a voting system that allows for participation, and then the legislature tries to change it. There was a vote by the people of Florida to allow people who'd served their time to have their voting rights restored when they'd finished their sentence. Now the Florida legislature, because they think that would benefit Democrats, and the legislature and governor are Republicans, they're trying to change what the voters did and say we have to pay all of your fines and fees, which is like a poll tax. And so now, instead of just accepting what the voters did, I'm sure there will be litigation. My guess is, if there's anything right in the world, the legislature will lose because you can't do a poll tax. And something that was simple that Floridians chose will now end up in court. And I think that's unfortunate.
Next question from the audience. Will there be funds available to maintain, update the voting systems and voting booths?
That's a very good question. You know, we've had sort of a partisan brawl on some of these voting rights measures because they're, I think, this is an overstatement, and I don't talk about Republicans and Democratic voters who live in this district, but the members of the legislature, members of the House and Senate, who feel that if more Americans vote, it will disadvantage Republicans. And therefore, they don't want more Americans to vote. I mean, I've had Republican members tell me that privately, directly. So that's the fight in Washington, not here in San Jose or around the country. I do think that we have an opportunity here to advance the cause of justice substantially.
Next, I'm going to combine three similar questions. With all attempts to maintain our Constitution being thwarted by the empirical president, will H.R. 1 even survive? Can the House keep H.R. 1 alive through 2019 to November, and how? And what can we do to influence the Senate to approve H.R. 1?
Well, those are all good questions. I wish I knew the answer to all of them. As we know, we have divided government right now. We have President Trump. The Republicans control the Senate. Democrats are in the majority in the House. And one of the things that about the U.S. Senate is that you need an extraordinary vote. You can stop things, although they're starting to change their filibuster rules. So we're stuck right now if Mitch McConnell does not want the provisions of H.R. 1. One thing I've also learned is that the Senate, especially the senators who are running for re-election, have to also listen to their constituents. And I've seen situations where the public gets up in arms about something, floods their either representatives or their senators with demands for action, and action actually happens. I think that's what's necessary for H.R. 1, at least some provisions of it. Now, what we're going to do, H.R. 1 has passed the House of Representatives. It's been sent to the Senate, so it's ready for action for them whenever they decide to take action. But as I mentioned, we are looking very carefully at taking component parts of H.R. 1, passing them separately, and sending those over to the Senate to see if we can't nudge them a little bit. Election security, which is what we're looking at. We're going to have a hearing next week in the House Administration Committee that I chair and has jurisdiction over elections. And then I hope we will have the bill out of H.R. 1 dealing with election security, and we might add a few things. We've had some input from scientists and engineers about open source software and some other things that we'll look at. We've got a ream of experts that are going to appear next week to see if we can make further improvements, and then we'll approve that. We'll send that to the Senate. How could that be a partisan issue? Every American's vote should be counted as it was cast. That's it. Pretty simple. Make sure that hackers don't break into the system. Make sure that hackers don't destroy the voter base. These should not be partisan issues. Now, the one thing where we did have some bipartisanship, and it was heartening, a number of years ago, we passed something called the Help America Votes Act. And it authorized, there are two processes for spending money at the federal level. One is called the authorization, where you have a bill, you authorize X amount to be spent. And the second part for that to actually happen is the appropriations process, where they allocate the money. There was several $100 million that were never allocated but through the appropriations process under HAVA, and they all had to do with securing election systems. So just before, we were agitating, we being on the Democratic side, agitating for doing something with election security, to helping the states move forward to secure their systems. And we had gridlock on that until finally, just before the election, the Appropriations Committee on a bipartisan basis said yes, and we actually appropriated all the money that was left under the Help America Votes Act that had been authorized. Unfortunately, it came too late because it takes a while through the state procurement process and the like. But it is helping states to secure their systems, and I'm hoping that we can play a further useful role as the federal government helping the states to secure their systems. I was on the, like Cindy and Dave, I was on the Board of Supervisors for a long time, and I will say, at the time, we didn't have the same concern about security as we do today. But people would complain that the voting systems took too long and the count was late, but there were other competing interests. I mean, we need to make sure that, we had law enforcement needs met and that the medical needs were met. And honestly, the registrar of voters, it was hard to compete with medical care, and it never rose to the top. So I think if we have a joint venture between the federal, state, and local governments to improve these systems, it will be very important, and we have authorized such sums as may be necessary to do that. So the appropriators are free to make the appropriations that are necessary.
What would H.R. 1 do to reduce the time that members of Congress spend fundraising? According to some investigative reports, it seems it ranges from 25 to 50% of a member's time. Are those accurate?
Well, two things. First, there is this provision where you can get a 6-to-1 match if you raise at least $50,000 with contributions of $200 or less. And that actually would be enough money out of the corporate wrongdoing account to fund most election campaigns. So that would free not only incumbent members of Congress, but their challengers to not spend time fundraising, with big donors, although you still would need to seek out smaller donors. In terms of how much time do people spend, I honestly don't know. I don't spend a lot of time. And as a matter of fact, there are call rooms in both the Republican and Democratic headquarters. I don't go over there. I do have to raise money for my campaign, like every other person who runs for office. I hired out of my campaign fund someone who does that. He makes the phone calls, he sends the emails. I don't. I spend all of my time working on legislation and public policy issues. Sometimes I do appear at events. In the last campaign, I was very anxious to have the Democrats take control of the House. I chair the California Democratic delegation, and I wanted to make sure that we made progress in Republican seats, and I did a lot of that, not in my office, obviously, but in my spare time campaigning for others. But I think a lot of members of Congress do, and both parties spend a lot of time fundraising, and I wish it weren't so, because we've got a lot to do. There are complicated issues that face us. It compels our time and attention, and I wish we would spend all of our time and attention on those public policy issues.
How can we get big money and dark money out of politics for once and for all?
Well, that's a very good question. Citizens United, one of the worst decisions ever made by the Supreme Court, basically equated money with speech and gave money the protection of the First Amendment. I think it's a very poorly crafted decision, radical departure from precedent, and yet it is what constrains us now because it is a Supreme Court decision. We have made an effort in H.R. 1 to overcome the worst parts of that decision. Even in Citizens United case, Justice Kennedy posits disclosure as the remedy to limitless money being spent. And of course, we never followed up with the disclosure. So we follow up with disclosure in H.R. 1, the Disclose Act, and other elements of it. We also control, and we believe constitutionally you can, having dark money flow through various shell groups so that no one can find out where the money is coming from. We require that corporations that spend money have to get permission from their shareholders to do that and to disclose that. With the Honest Ads Act, we make sure that any money is being spent. Voters know about it. And I think given the Supreme Court case, that's at this point all we can do. We also do something about 501c3 political activity. We do have a First Amendment right to speak. You don't have a First Amendment right for a tax deduction. So, you know, if you're going to do politics, you're not going to get subsidized to do politics by the taxpayers. And the final, I guess, answer is we need a better Supreme Court to revisit that Citizen United decision.
A few questions on this same topic. H.R. 1 requires presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do. President Trump is the only candidate or president in modern times who has not disclosed his tax returns. And it leads, especially in his case, because he has maintained his business while being the president. It has raised all kinds of questions about the emoluments clause, and we don't have any idea of what's coming in and what isn't. So I do think not only for him, but for, you know, his predecessors did it, and I would hope that anybody who's running for Congress, I think most of them have, would do that. I think people want to know what the deal is. I think in terms of, you know, I've been thinking about, and I wonder if people are interested in whether I should do this or not. There is a statute, and it's been in law since the Teapot Dome scandal, that the Ways and Means Committee can obtain the tax return of anybody, and including the president. The Ways and Means Committee has done that, and the Treasury Secretary has said, well, maybe, and there's every indication that they will not comply with the law. There's a second, and there's because there's no need for the Ways and Means Committee to have it, which is not the point. I mean, the Congress does the oversight. The people who are being overseen don't decide what oversight should be done. But the emoluments clause basically says you can't accept anything of value from a foreign government if you're the president, unless the Congress approves it. Well, we've been focusing on anything of value, including all of the funds flowing into the Trump organization. What if we said, I want to know how much money it is so Congress can give permission as a reason why? I could do that. You know, sometimes we have given permission. If somebody goes to a foreign country and they are presented with a gift and you don't want to embarrass them, and you come back and you can either give permission, or usually you hand it over to the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian, so it doesn't benefit you personally. But, you know, it's one way to kind of flush out this issue I've been thinking about. Anybody who thinks I should do that? Okay, maybe I'll do that next week.
This question is from Kathy. Zoe, how do you keep your positive energy up in such a difficult, trying, dark time?
That's a nice question. As we mentioned, we will take questions from anybody on any topic towards the end, and it's now 11:45 or 11. You know, I feel very positive about the United States. I think we have a great country. I think the people who live here are smart and optimistic and talented, and that our future is bright. That's what I think about all of you and our country. And that makes me optimistic about the United States and about our future. We have, you know, some threats, not just to our country, but to the world, that are ominous. Climate change it's hard to sleep at night on what we haven't done on that. But I also know here in Silicon Valley, with the science knowledge and technology knowledge that we have, that if we ever get serious about this, and we better do that soon, we're going to have an opportunity to cope with that successfully. So that's why you make me optimistic. Thank you.
How do you expect H.R. 1 to have any impact on the behavior of a president who already faces no consequences for violating the law? Why aren't you imposing those consequences, and why haven't you started impeachment yet?
Well, I am, I think, the only member of Congress who has worked on both the Nixon and the Clinton impeachment. On the Clinton impeachment as a member of the House Judiciary Committee, and as a young staffer for my predecessor, Don Edwards, I worked on his staff during the Nixon impeachment. And I do think if you want to take a look at what's the model for when action is necessary, it's not the Clinton impeachment, it's the Nixon impeachment, because it was serious behavior that threatened the integrity of the system of government. By the time the committee acted, not only did the Bipartisan Judiciary Committee act, huge swaths of the American public felt it was necessary to take that action. And so that is what I'm looking at as a model. I don't think, I've read through the Mueller report, and I'm trying to compare it to what we saw in the Nixon administration. In the Nixon case, we had 3 articles of impeachment. The first really chronicled his misbehavior, the use of the IRS to go after the enemies, and on and on and on. Article 2 was obstruction of justice. His efforts, ultimately unsuccessful, to keep the Congress and everyone else from finding about his misbehavior in Article 1. And finally, there was Article 3, which is stonewalling the Congress on the impeachment inquiry. If you take a look at the Mueller report, Volume 1 basically says we've seen the following things. There was a systematic, broad effort by the Russians to influence the election in the United States to benefit and elect Donald Trump. It basically says that. But it doesn't find a criminal conspiracy between the president and the Russians to do that. So we don't have the equivalent Article 1 in Volume 1. Volume 2 of the Mueller report is not too far off from Article 2 in the Nixon administration. The Mueller didn't reach a conclusion. He pretty obviously felt that was for Congress to make. And the president's announcement that he is going to refuse to comply with any subpoenas from the Congress, you can't do that. I mean, that's an Article 3 constitutional effort. You have to have the capacity for oversight of the executive branch by the legislative branch. That goes back hundreds of years. And if you want to have a functioning democracy, that has to occur. So I don't think we're at a point where impeachment is appropriate. I do think that we need to have hearings on some of the items, well, the whole Mueller report. And I have questions, and you can't outsource the decision-making on misconduct to somebody else, although we want to see all the evidence and the full unredacted report from Mr. Mueller, and then we'll see where we are. I don't think impeachment is a great thing for the United States. It's wrenching. It takes all the time away from everything else. It should only be done if there's no other, if it's an obligation that you have to do that. And I don't think that is yet where we are. We will do further work on this, and then we'll see what's next.
There are some other non-HR 1 questions, several on train noise. Can you address the status of your efforts on the Union Pacific trains running in the middle of the night?
Yes. I know that this is very troublesome for a lot of people because I have heard from many of you about, as a matter of fact, I hear the trains in the middle of the night as well, not as loudly as those of you who live closer to the tracks, but I hear them loud enough to know how troublesome they are. What's happened is the train schedules have changed, and it used to be we didn't have these middle of the night endeavors. I asked the Federal Rail Authority to come out and find out what the heck was going on, and I have no complaints about their response. They set out a team of investigators right away who they took a look at the entire situation, and what they reported, and I think we have their letter on my website, was that we have unprotected intersections, and we also have people who are in the right-of-way, and under the safety rules, you have to sound your horn in those cases. The remedy really is a local one, which is you have to have a quiet zone, and in order to do a quiet zone, the city has to put up, or the county, whoever the jurisdiction is that has the road that's crossing the track, barriers so that cars can't go into the intersection when the trains go by. The city of San Jose has done that in certain parts of the city. That has not been done in the areas where I'm getting the complaints right now. I met with Mayor Liccardo a couple weeks ago. We talked through this with the city. I know that he's very concerned about it. They're looking at what they can do. A big issue is not just the quiet zone, but we have homeless encampments on the right-of-way. And so if the train engineer sees a person in the right-of-way for safety reasons, they're going to sound that horn. You can't have people living in the right-of-way. I mean, that has to be abated. And so the mayor and I talked about that. I also think that Union Pacific, as the owner of the right-of-way, has a responsibility to maintain its property and to make sure that trespassers are not present on the right-of-way. And, you know, we have a strong discussion about the scourge of homelessness. I am concerned, as all of you are, but you can't put a tent on the freeway or on the right-of-way. That just can't be allowed to occur. So that's all I know at this point, but the mayor and I are hoping that we can work together if there's anything I can do to help the city as they move forward, because, as I say, the remedy is primarily a local one. He knows and the council knows, and I'm very eager to help. So I hope we can resolve this, because it's driving people up the wall, and I include myself.
Can you provide an update on H.R. 6, the DREAM Act?
Yes. Yes, I can. One of the things that I think we need to do is to allow young people who were brought to this country without their proper papers. It wasn't their decision. They didn't have the adult capacity to decide, and many of them have lived here for years and years and years to gain their legal status. I've met hundreds of these kids. In some cases, they don't even find out they're not an American citizen until they go to apply for something, and then they find out, much to their chagrin, they actually weren't born here. In many ways, they're Americans in every way except the paperwork. So there's been an effort. One of my Republican colleagues recently told me, he was at a town hall, and he's for the DREAM Act. And he told me that the analogy he used was, I'm a police officer and you're speeding. I ticket you, the driver, and I also ticket your kids in the back seat because they're speeding too. The bill that is before us is the most expansive and generous provision of the DREAM Act that has yet been introduced. And the legislative process is really, the bill is the starting point of the legislative process. Then it goes to a committee, which is the Judiciary Committee where I serve. A hearing is held. Then there's something called a markup, which you go through the bill line by line, make suggestions, offer changes, vote on the proposed changes, and then ultimately decide whether to what's called vote it out or send it to the House for their consideration. The bill's been introduced, the hearing has been held, and we need to have the markup in the Judiciary Committee. I have been trying to sort out some sentiment among the Judiciary Committee members on some of the provisions of the bill that I think might be a little more expansive than most people might want, and how we can resolve that. I'm pretty confident that we will, and we should have a markup within the next few weeks. I believe we will have a report out of the committee, and I believe it will pass the House. And then the question is, what will the Senate do? I cannot answer for Mitch McConnell, but if it's the right thing to do, and I'm hopeful that the public will force the Senate to act on the DREAM Act. I've talked to a number of Republican senators who say, yes, they realize something needs to be done. So I'm not without some hope that we will make progress on this. Does that answer the question?
Is there anything you can do to address the for-profit detention system abusing immigrants? The conditions immigrants and refugees are treated in are humane. Immigrants have died on ICE custody. Is there any accountability?
Well, there is a way, and that's to prohibit funds to be used for for-profit incarceration. At the end, which I think we should do, at the end of the Obama administration, then Secretary Jay Johnson established a panel of experts to advise him on this question. And to be honest, I think he stacked it in such a way that he hoped they would come back and say, no problem here, keep going. But in fact, what happened was when the experts looked at the conditions in these facilities and also how much money we're spending per day, I mean, it's outrageous the amount of money we're spending for what we're getting, they came back with a recommendation that the for-profit incarceration industry be put out of business and that we replace it with federally run institutions to the extent that we have institutions. There was a project that was ended by the Trump administration called the Case Management Program. Once someone comes into the United States seeking asylum, which is lawful under the Immigration and Nationality Act, they go through a first screen, it's called a credible fear interview, where the hearing officer decides whether or not they have made a credible case that they qualify for political asylum. The ultimate decision on whether or not they get asylum is made by an immigration judge at an immigration hearing. So what happens to that person between the time they've been found to have a credible fear and the time they actually go before the judge? Well, right now, the Trump administration is saying in every case, those individuals should be kept locked up. That's not really necessary because the point is you want them to go to the hearing. And we had this case management project where we followed up with individuals, told them when the hearing was, like 98% in that range showed up for their hearing. So they canceled that project and we refunded it. When I was down in El Paso several weeks ago, I was touring the ICE facility and I asked the ICE officers how the new reinstated project was going. Blank stares. They did not actually reimpose that program, which I think is a cost-effective way to make sure that people show up. And the other thing that's very problematic is we have this huge backlog. We don't have adequate judicial personnel. I mean, we shouldn't have cases that linger on and on and on. These ought to be promptly heard. If the person has asylum, they get to stay. If they don't get asylum, they got to leave. That decision should not trail for years. It should be made in a much prompter fashion. And in order to do that, you don't just put all the money at barriers. You also put money in judicial personnel to make the decision so you can have an orderly system, which we lack right now. And I'll just end with this, although it's broader than the question. We do have not unprecedented numbers, but large numbers of individuals coming to our border seeking asylum. I was down in El Salvador a month ago, and they are making some progress, and the numbers actually reflected of people leaving El Salvador. We have, with the other governments, but we've got FBI down there on a transnational drug Drug Task Force. They have made many arrests with MS-16, 13 in New York, in California, in El Salvador. The homicide rate in El Salvador dropped 50%. Now, it's still high, but that's a huge change in a short period of time. They've also funded some things for individuals. I mean, most people don't say, gosh, I'd like to leave my whole family, the place where my family's lived forever, and go to some place I've never heard of, I've never been before, and risk my life getting there. That's not something people do frivolously. And so in some of the things that we're doing in terms of building opportunities for people in El Salvador, we're having an impact. We went to a rudimentary programming school, about 1,000 young people saying, we don't want to go to the U.S., we want to do computer programming in El Salvador. Well, great, they have an opportunity in their own country. But for people who are fleeing, it doesn't make a lot of sense to deal with that issue at our border. We ought to be forward staffing our asylum officers. We ought to be doing it. This shouldn't just be a U.S. issue. This should be a Western Hemisphere issue. There are other countries who've signed onto the same asylum treaties we have. So we ought to be working with the UN. We ought to be involving other Western Hemisphere countries like Canada and even some of the European countries that are interested in having additional people come to their countries to see who is really an asylee and how to locate them in a place where they're safe. But we also need to have international efforts to reduce the level of violence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Honduras has the highest murder rate of any country not at war. So we're not going to stop people running for their lives by saying we're going to have a burdensome paperwork problem. We need to go to the root of the problem, in my judgment.
As we approach 11 a.m., the final question is, there's a real danger that California may lose a representative because of the citizen question in the next census. What can be done about this?
Well, there could be a danger. It's not just losing a representative, it will be losing funds for a whole variety of programs where we pay our tax money and it flows back to us in various programs, and our money will go to other states if we don't get a full count. The answer is to get a full count. And one of the things, we had Tony Atkins, who was here, the leader of the state Senate. I met with the Speaker of the California Assembly. They are providing funds to work with local governments and community groups to make sure that people answer the census question. They've spent, I think, almost allocated or appropriated about $100 million so far, and I think there may be more. So we're all going to have to work on that. The Supreme Court is going to make the decision. It's very clear that this was a political decision made by the Secretary of Commerce. I mean, he said some things to the Congress that clearly were not correct. I mean, we could see from his emails that what he told us was not, in fact, correct. He said the Justice Department asked him to have the question. We found out that he asked the Justice Department to ask him to ask the question as a cover, as a pretext for what he did. So I am hopeful that we can stand up and get everyone counted. I know that we have some efforts out in the hallway. We've got the county supervisor Chavez and Cortese are here working with the other supervisors and administrators. I hope you'll take time to look at what they've got and to help volunteer to make sure that every person is counted at the census. It matters a lot, and one of the things I want to tell people is stand up and be counted. Thank you very much for letting me visit with you.
So let's give a big round of applause to our amazing member of Congress. She is wonderful. I also wanted to ask, just to give a round of applause also to all the volunteers. Let's give them a round of applause, to her staff and